León, buenas tardes. La Biblioteca de la Cuna Centro A ha querido celebrar el centenario del nacimiento de Orson Welles este año, un poco tarde, pero fue en mayo, con la presencia de Patrick McGILLIGAN, que está aquí a mi izquierda, y es un profesor universitario americano que ha escrito ya ha publicado 20 libros de cine. 10 de ellos son biografías de grandes autores, entre los que se encuentran, muy famosos por haber sido traducidos al castellano, que se encuentran los de Clint Eastwood, Fritz Lang, Nicholas Ray, George Cukor, Hitchcock, etc. Él es profesor de la Universidad de Wisconsin y nos va a hablar de un periodo de Welles no muy conocido, que es su infancia y juventud, que está algo tratado en el libro de Barbara Liming de hace 25 años. También se encuentra de nosotros, a mi izquierda también, a la izquierda de Patrick, Antonio Castro, que ha sido profesor de la Universidad de Complutense de Madrid en la especialidad de narrativa en medios audiovisuales y ha publicado la friolera de 44 libros sobre cine. El más famoso de ellos es uno de los primeros, El cine español en el banquillo, y uno de los últimos es precisamente las actas del Congreso del Comité de Actividades Norteamericanas, cuya conferencia hemos tenido esta mañana en la Escuela de Ciencias de la Universidad de Ciencias de la Información. Pues primeramente hablará Patrick y después del speech de Patrick, que durará media hora, se someterá a un interrogatorio de nosotros dos y del público en general y podéis hacer las preguntas que creáis convenientes. Y nada más. Patrick?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to BILBAO. We did have a great conference this morning talking about the blacklist, which is different for me because I've been talking about it for decades, but this will be the first time I ever speak about my Orson Welles book in public, because it was published last week in the US. I don't have a copy myself. They offered to send me one. I was in Sweden and I said, no, it's too big, I don't want to carry it around. It's a different book for me. Usually I write what would be called a cradle-to-grave biography, starting with birth and ending with the death of the subject. A very complete biography. But the idea of this book was to cover the youth of Orson Welles leading up to the making of Citizen Kane, and to find in that youth and in his early life all the seeds of his greatness and of his later problems in life, and also to see the foreshadowing of Citizen Kane in all of the incidents in his life that he drew on for that film, to cover the creation of that film, in a sense, leading up to the first day on the set. And after 800 pages, that's where we are in the book. He's about to call action on the first take, and that's the last line in the second to the last chapter, action. And then there's one more chapter in the book which takes place on the last day of his life, and it's a long chapter because he got up in the morning, he's older, heavier, somewhat defeated, and he's appearing on a talk show, and he's going to do a magic trick which he has elaborately rehearsed. And on that day, his authorized biographer is also going to be on the talk show, and they're going to, for the first time on a talk show, he's going to talk about some things in his life which he did not like to talk about, including Citizen Kane. And so it's different than all of my other books. I didn't do a single interview, which I talked to people, but I wouldn't call any of them an interview because he would have been 100 years old. So anyone who knew him at the time of Citizen Kane would be 100 years old. least. So I'm hesitant about interviewing people over 90 years old. I sometimes think it's not fair to people's memories and to the questioning that they might undergo. So I drew on a lot of different sources, and because I'm from Wisconsin and because he was born in Kenosha, down the road from where I live in Milwaukee, I started really with his birth and really before his birth to construct a life story that up until the time of Citizen Kane explains him more sympathetically and really explains the rest of his life and career without going into it. So I hope that, it's hard to summarize, I hope that helps. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Dr. Castro?
Bueno, yo creo que una de las cosas que nos puede aclarar bastante un poco la personalidad de Wells y su infancia, hay algunas, como apuntaba quedando hace un momento, algunos rasgos que aparecen en la biografía de Bárbara Liming, pero siempre se ha hablado, pero se acaba concretando muy poco con las difíciles relaciones que tiene con su familia más directa, desde su adoración por su madre, ligada a la música, sus problemas con su padre, sus problemas con su hermano. Todas estas cosas se han hablado, pero siempre un poco sotobosque, sin acabar de concretar. Incluso en algún momento se habló de que se consideraba culpable de lo que le había ocurrido a su hermano, de cómo se llevaba muy mal con su padre, pero que muy poco antes de desaparecer se habían reconciliado. Todas estas cosas supongo que con el trabajo de investigación de Pat habrán quedado medianamente claras y es un poco lo que yo quería iniciar esta conversación con ese tema.
Yes. I think the previous people who wrote about wrote about Wells did a pretty good job considering. Now, in the case of Barbara Leeming, she was using Orson as his own source about his life story. And of course, his mother dies when he's 10 or 11 years old. His father dies when he's 15. So everything he says about them is colored by what other people said to him, including his guardian, the person who took over for him, his custody after his parents died, Dr. Maurice Bernstein, and then his prep school headmaster, Roger Hill. So some of the things that we think we know about him turn out to be false. I see this in various ways in my research. But the first thing I did was go to Kenosha and read 18 years of daily microfilm of the city newspaper, there's no other way to read it. And starting from his birth, he was on the front page of the city newspaper because his parents were so prominent. So his birth is announced on the front page. It's very hard to condense everything that the book is about, but it's not really a long, laborious book. It really reads like an adventure story. His parents were, he used the phrase, mythically wonderful in his conversations with Barbara Leeming. And they were. His mother was extraordinary, but so was his father. And terrible things happened to them, and to some extent, he feels guilt and responsibility for what happened, including to his older brother, older by 10 years. But I think it would be natural for anybody to feel these things without him actually bearing any real responsibility towards what happened to everybody in the family. But you see him from an early age pushed to be a special person through his parents. And without going into a lot of detail, I can tell you that he's not the first member of the Wells family to be in a motion picture. Both his mother and father were. He's not the first to direct a stage play. His mother did. He's not the first to shake the hand of a president. His mother shook the hand of at least one president. She was a very prominent suffragette. So they influence him positively in a lot of really, really interesting ways, politically, artistically, socially, but most importantly, I think, by their example as extraordinary people themselves. And so I go through this in great detail in the book, right down to there's 75 pages that go by even before his birth, because it's a very, very interesting family story that really helped to shape his values as well as his personality. Do you want me to be more specific, Dr. Castro?
Lo que considere oportuno, no quiero decir que a mí me pueden interesar muchas cosas, pero a lo mejor con lo que has dicho es suficiente, o quizá a lo mejor la gente que no conoce demasiado bien el tema se podía plantear qué es lo que había ocurrido con cada uno de estos casos, el de su padre y el de su hermano sobre todo, porque Wells siempre declaró que había dejado la música porque desde que se murió su madre, él que era un aficionado, no solo aficionado, sino que le gustaba tocar el piano, le gustaba la música, que no pudo dedicarse a la música a partir de ese momento. Esas son las declaraciones de Wells, no sé si es muy verdad corroborado por tus investigaciones.
Well, he was educated in piano and in violin, and his mother was a classical pianist, and she gave concerts. And I think he said also, and it's true that that wasn't going to be his career. He did stop performing, although he did a little performing musically after that point. But she, for example, was an elocutionist also. And when she was really, in many ways, like him, she was willing to do anything in show business. So she would prefer to play a classical piano piece, but if you were at a party and you demanded a march or a waltz, she would sit down and do that. She would rather put on a serious play, but if you asked for a comedy, she would do that. And she, when she moved away from strictly concert piano, she becomes someone who is very, very important in spoken word recitals. And you can see her influence on him in that. He's giving public talks when he's still in school. He goes on trips with his father after his mother died, and he comes back and he goes to women's clubs and chambers of commerce, and he gives talks, and then he does magic tricks or sketches while he's giving the talks. This is all when he's 14 or 15 years old, and even younger. So she dies rather mysteriously, and I go into the circumstances in my book differently than other books. It was some tragedy that even the hospital couldn't figure out. They had to do an autopsy, and they still could not figure out why she died, but she was quite young. Then 5 years later, the story is that his father dies. The story that we know until now is that his father dies after a trip they take to the Far East, which is quite interesting, an ocean voyage. They come back and the father dies. Most books say because of alcohol. But again, I go into the circumstances and the records. And Orson felt very guilty, particularly about his father, because he had stopped talking to him on the advice of his prep school headmaster, who believed his father was an alcoholic and that Orson was only encouraging him if he was in personal interaction with him regularly. And I don't think that's exactly what happened, and I go into it in some detail in the book. And it's a very tragic event that his father dies when he's 15, and yet it sheds light on what a courageous man he was, what a strong individual he was. He had these very crippling things happen to him, and he really forged ahead with his life and career regardless of these circumstances. Another tragedy in the family is that he had a brother who was 10 years older who, when Orson was still in school, was institutionalized as being insane, having some kind of mental problem. And those records are withheld from the public, and it's unclear exactly what was wrong with him, and it was wrong with him from an early age. But I don't think Orson was particularly haunted by what happened to his brother. He was very kind to him throughout his life and sent him money throughout his life. But he was 10 years older, and again, it may have put pressure on him to be the one in the family to succeed. He's the only one left with the family name who's doing something artistic. But the great influence of his parents were to urge him to express himself artistically, which they did from early boyhood. Whether it was in music or art, for a while he was an artist, and he took art lessons, and he was quite a good artist, and often said he wished he was a better artist because he really enjoyed it and he wouldn't have minded making a living out of it. And I've seen, there aren't too many examples, but I was in Woodstock, Illinois, for a centennial celebration, and a man came up with an oil painting that was hanging in his home from Orson's prep school days. And it was extraordinary. It was quite wonderful. So he had talent in all of these areas, and in a way it's a key to his personality that he's like his mother. He didn't want to do just film or just theater or just radio or even just magic or just writing or just politics. He did all of these things, and that was really the influence of his parents as much as anything else.
¿Se puede considerar que Wells era autodidacta?
No. Quite the opposite. First of all, yes, in the sense that he never was awake for a moment without learning from the person who he's sitting next to or observing. But one of the great things about his early life is that his mother had a foreshadowing of her own early death. And she was in a very glittering circle in Chicago of newsmen and artists and musicians, both from the Chicago Museum, the Chicago Symphony, and his life was filled with these people. Everybody famous who came through Chicago to perform came to their house for dinner. So you see, and you can track this in the newspapers and things, that they would have these dinner parties, and the great, Caruso would come. He's at Highland Park when he's a young teenager having dinner with Ethel Barrymore. And his father knew everyone because the family had a great tradition. They'd see every show that came to not just Kenosha or Chicago, but to any place nearby. And they would always go backstage and meet the people and invite them home with them. And so he knew all these very, very, not only glamorous, but sophisticated personalities when he was a very young boy. And he was allowed to stay up if he had taken his nap, and he hated to nap, he hated to sleep. So he would stay up late at the dinner table with these people, absorbing the conversation and learning to speak as an adult, even when he was a boy. So, and then his mother and father arranged private lessons with the most important musicians, the most important artists of Chicago, the most important magicians, the cartoonists for the newspaper. And all of these people, and it's one of the fascinating aspects of his life story, that he had many surrogate parents, that everyone realized the parents before they died, they were divorced, they were broken up, there was a broken home, so he would be sent places for good influence. And he would be under the influence of these very, very educated and interesting people who had something to say about everything, politics, art, whatever you wanted to talk about. So that by the time he graduated from prep school at the age of 15, everyone else in the prep school went to a higher grade or went to college. And he felt he had already learned all that he was meant to learn in school because he was already ahead of everybody. So he's not really self-taught, but he made every opportunity one that was good for him. Every time he met someone who could teach him something.
¿Nos puedes contar algo de cuando fue adolescente, viajó a España y tuvo una corrida de toros?
Yes. So at the end of his second year after school, he was very anxious. At the first year, he went to Ireland, and I went to Ireland to do some research. It was a good excuse to go to Ireland. Then the second year, he went to North Africa, and he went to Sevilla. And the reason why he went is he and his headmaster decided to do a book about how to produce Shakespeare plays for students. And that was the project that his headmaster thought of to keep him busy. They were always trying to keep Orson busy, keep him constructively occupied, because otherwise he drove you crazy. You know, you had to really find things for him to do that were constructive and engaged his imagination, or otherwise he sat around bored and moody and drove you crazy. So they thought of this idea, which he jumped at because he had been watching Shakespeare and loving Shakespeare and even producing Shakespeare in school, always putting on performances himself in his living room and in his neighborhood. So he loved this idea, but he said, well, I want some of my father's bequest to go on a boat trip and go to North Africa. I will write the book, which was really an editing. He was editing Shakespeare and giving stage directions and doing sketches for scenery and designery and that kind of thing. And then he eventually, at the end of this trip, and he sort of he does the work in spurts because he's having such a good time in Africa and on the boat. But by the time he gets to Sevilla, he has sold some pulp fiction stories in the US, and they sent him some money in Spain. So he decides to stay in Sevilla for a while. And biographers disagree as to whether he really was a bullfighter. He was only there for a few weeks. And I talked to a documentarist from Sevilla who spent a long time tracing what happened to him. And I'm of the opinion that, yes, he spent his money and bought some bulls and bought his way into trying out to be a bullfighter, and was a miserable failure, but fell in love with bullfighting and with Spain, and it was a kind of a glorious period in his life. And coming back on the boat to America, he finished the book, and the book was published a year or two later, you know, before he's 20 years old. The book is still in print, very good book. If he had done nothing after that, he would have written a very good book before he was 20. So one of the things I found out about Orson, which surprises people, is that he was surprisingly truthful. And if he said, I was a bullfighter, then I went to look at the dates, and I tried to talk to people, and I tried to match it up with other things that were said and try and see how accurate it was. And time and again, when he was the witness to what he was talking about, when he wasn't saying someone told me or that it happened to my father before I was born, but when he was the person, time and again, it checked that he was truthful. And I've written about a lot of different people, some of whom are not very truthful, and he was, I think, telling the truth about having been a bullfighter for a very brief period as a kid, as a young teenager in Sevilla.
También se han discutido mucho las opiniones políticas de Orson Welles. Él ha declarado en varias ocasiones que no murió en la brigada Lincoln porque era pies planos, porque si no, y no le aceptaron, que si no hubiera habido la guerra de España y hubiera muerto en la guerra civil. Después, él mismo declaró que tenía intención de ser presidente de los Estados Unidos, en ocasiones está preciso que había escrito bastantes de los discursos de Roosevelt, y sin embargo no está clara tampoco cuál fue su relación con todo el periodo del Comité de Actividades Antiamericanas y su huida a Europa. Unos dicen que por los impuestos, otros dicen que por razones políticas. Probablemente, como ese es un tema que especialmente te ha interesado siempre, quizás nos pudiéramos dar luz sobre todos estos planteamientos.
Yeah, first of all, about his politics, that was a legacy of his parents, and he was a very political person from early boyhood. He heard about it growing up. His mother gave speeches at rallies. His mother shook the hand of Woodrow Wilson in order to try and talk Woodrow Wilson into passing an amendment so women could vote. And his father was a rumored consensus candidate for mayor of Kenosha, and later becomes a union buster, strikebreaker at his factory when they have a bitter and violent strike. That was not unlike liberal Republicans at the time who saw unions as being a real threat for the future. But he came from very, very liberal parents who were very socially active and politically engaged, and he carried this on. And I think when he gets to New York in the mid-1930s, and especially making the Voodoo Macbeth in Harlem and interacting with black people who were out of work, his political consciousness gets very awakened, and he becomes very closely involved with many, many causes, including black rights and black justice, but also in Spain. And he's one of these people. I was talking about someone else this morning. I said he sacrificed his career for politics. There's no question that Orson Welles sacrificed some of his career for politics. I mean, he does it, first of all, with Citizen Kane, which is a politically very explicit film and was detested and at the time of its release by people in power, including William Randolph Hearst, who saw it as a political film. But also he does it constantly up until the time he leaves for Europe. He takes a year or two off in the mid-1940s, and he becomes a crusading newspaper columnist and gives speeches and writes speeches, as you say, for the Roosevelt. And sometimes it's on the cutting edge of very, very difficult causes, championing black people who are in court, Latinos who are in trouble in Los Angeles. And he's giving radio broadcasts and writing newspaper columns. And this part of his career is often forgotten, as other parts of his career are often also minimized. So, I mean, he's a person with many, many aspects to his character, but politics is one. So by the end of the 1940s, and all along, he's very close with members of the Communist Party who are part of his creative circle. Howard Koch, who wrote War of the Worlds, later becomes one of the Hollywood 19, but many, many people, and many people who were eventually blacklisted. So he was a very politically engaged person, and by the end of the 1940s, you say, well, maybe he left because of taxes, maybe he left because he was having a love affair, which is true, maybe he left because he no longer had much viability in Hollywood that was changing and that had always been difficult for him to do what he wanted to do there. And maybe he left because he left right after 1947 and the House Un-American Activities Committee had come to Hollywood. Maybe he left because he saw what was going to happen in terms of the blacklist. I think all are true. I think all are true. And he had the wherewithal and the ability to sense all of that because he really had a great social antenna, and he left for Europe. And a lot of people left Hollywood at the time of the blacklist who weren't blacklisted per se, or were going to be blacklisted, or said, all my friends are blacklisted, I'm leaving, or they saw what was coming politically and they got out. And it's also because I think it's very important, and it's an aspect of my book because it's set largely in the Midwest, that he didn't have the same attitude towards success in Broadway or success in Hollywood that a lot of people who were from New York or Los Angeles did. And he didn't. He was much more itinerant always than other people. He was much more quixotic. He was much more capricious about his interests. And so it made complete sense for him to leave Hollywood. And sometimes later in his life, he would express regret, oh, I never did in film what I might have been able to do. But I don't think he expressed regret about leaving Hollywood. I've heard him, he expressed regret. He was invited, because he was from Wisconsin, by the Democratic Party and urged to perhaps run for senator in 1948 against the Republican candidate was Joseph McCarthy. And I think that's about as far as he got in his political ambitions. And he thought about it. He was tempted. And later on he said, I should have, because then maybe I could have stopped him or helped him to stop him. But politics was just part of what he did. But I think it was enough to blacklist him. He was very definitely left-wing.
de Wells es una frase que se hizo muy famosa tratando de definir esa época diciendo que lo terrible de esa historia es que la izquierda se traicionó por sus víctimas. ¿Qué opinas de esa frase?
Well, when he comes back from, he's not very political when he's in Europe, and then when he comes back from Europe, he's less political. He certainly was not a communist, and he always, he did things in conjunction with American communists, including he ran for Equity, which is the actors union leadership post with other communists. He was not one. So he would do things with them, but he was not an ideological person about anything. So communists, the real communists in Hollywood or in New York, were ideological and very, very rigid sometimes in their thinking. And also, it's important to say they were very involved in the idea of the working class and Marxism. He was not interested. He gets that from his parents too. He's not doesn't go overboard for the working class or for Marx. So he may have said, and he did say at various times, disparaging things about the communists. But I think he was burned by what happened in Hollywood and by the blacklist. And it was quite common, even for the communists later on, the Hollywood communists later on, to say bad things about the communists and say that they were too rigid and they made things difficult and they made the wrong decision this way or that way. But he never, some people who started out very left-wing in their lives, like Jimmy Cagney, he comes at the end of his life, he's for Ronald Reagan, very right-wing. This is not true of Orson. He stays very liberal, left liberal, but less active. And that also is very, very common among people who are blacklisted or in some way suffered because of the blacklist. They're shy about getting involved publicly in things afterwards.
¿Nos podías hablar un poco de su, cuando era joven, se fue a Dublín, pasándose por pintor, y ahí se convirtió en actor de teatro, con Michael McGILLIGAN?
McLeamore, yeah. Not sure how to pronounce it, yeah. And your question? Was it? Yes. Yes, when he graduated from what was essentially a lower high school, and as I said, this was when he was 15, his father had just died. He puts on a version of Richard III for the graduation ceremony, which is 3 or 4 hours long, exhausts everyone, and but it sounds kind of spectacular and kind of messy. And then everyone else has plans, including going to college, and his headmaster and his guardian, who's watching over his money theoretically, want him to do something. Should you be a painter? Should you be an actor? Should you be a writer? He doesn't know. And by the end of the summer, he's read about this theater in Dublin, the Gate Theater, and he proposes to his guardian, who he has been driving nuts all summer, why don't I go on a painting tour of Ireland, and when I get done traveling and doing some painting, I will apply to Trinity College in Dublin. And his guardian says yes. So this is a pretty well documented period of his life, but I went more deeply into it to really follow his itinerary and see how it influenced him. And it's true, he gets to Dublin, he pretends that he has a great resume, but he's very impressive physically by this time. We know how impressive physically he was, but by this time already he was quite a physical specimen. And the two people running the gate took a look at him, and they listened to him, and they said, well, come back for an audition tomorrow. And he had done a lot. He was actually extremely sophisticated about theater and the arts, and could bluff or bullshit his way through lots of situations. They talked him to an audition, and he made his professional debut, meaning he was being paid, on the stage of the Gate Theatre in Dublin when he was still just before he's 16 years old, I think. And he does quite a bit in Dublin, including he ruffles feathers and he chases women and he makes enemies and he's in the press constantly, even though, and sometimes he's writing the stuff for the press under a pseudonym as publicity releases and sending it in, including he directs professionally in Dublin, which I discovered in my research for the first time, because the Gate Theatre was a very, very important theatre. It still is, and it's still in Dublin, and if you walk into the rotunda off of McConnell, of the park there are big pictures of Orson, along with other great alumni of the theatre. They're very busy and important, and you couldn't be too busy for Orson, because he wanted to do lots of things. So he wanted to design sets, he wanted to direct, and they just wanted him to do one thing, and so they had a side theater, which was a kind of artistic little sideline that they ran when the main stage wasn't presenting productions. And he and another actor took that over for a couple of months, and he designed sets for 6 or 7 productions, and the reviews are in the Irish newspaper saying, magnificent creation. So he was a set designer, and he did his first directing. He directed a play for this group. All of this while he was still just not quite a year out of high school. And so it was a very, very formative experience for him, because these two people who ran the Gate Theatre, they were not schmoes. They were really, really towering figures in European theatre. They followed all the European trends. They knew how to do things on a low budget, which is very important to Orson's entire career. They were very in love with expressionist techniques of both decor as well as acting. They taught him, they struggled with him, and he said throughout the rest of his life, and he had a kind of a love-hate relationship. They were a homosexual couple, open about their homosexuality, and yet also sometimes trespassing on other people's lives. They had sometimes had very fractious relationship, but throughout the rest of his life, he said that he learned everything he knew and needed to know about directing for the stage from one of them, and then he learned that the whole thing was a learning crucible for him in the theater. And so he had gone to Ireland, I think, thinking, well, maybe I'm a painter. He did a lot of painting, and then he looked at it and said, I guess I'm not a painter, I'm not that good. And then he came back thinking he was an actor, because he had acted professionally.
Bueno, el público tiene la oportunidad de preguntar lo que se le ocurra a parte de McGILLIGAN. ¿Que alguno te quiera hablar?
Yes.
Espera que te den un micrófono. Como que necesitas para poder.
Good afternoon. Congratulations for your excellent performance. And can you tell us something about the relationship between Orson Welles, an RKO leader in that time to produce Citizen Kane, Henry Sheffner? And he was Sheffner, a very important person in the making of the film.
Yeah, I go into this relationship quite a bit. George Schaefer, who was the president of the head of production at RKO, not a famous person in Hollywood history, and he had come up through sales ranks in Paramount and other studios. And his real specialty was to figure out how to sell any kind of film, including especially odd or artistic films, and he could tell you what theater in Boston, what that theater on that side of town, what the audiences liked, and what the theater on the other side of town, what the audiences were like, and so he would know how to book theaters. And he rose up and he came to RKO at a time when RKO was not doing well, and his idea was to bring in new people as well as famous people and give them some autonomy in doing whatever they wanted to do creatively. And he had had some experience doing this earlier in the decade. He sponsored, for example, Hecton MacArthur, who were the great screenwriting team, very good friends with Orson. And they made their own films. They worked for money for other directors and for studios, but they made a series of their own highly quirky comedies under his stewardship. He let them do whatever they want to do. He figured out how to make money off of it. And so they were able to say to Orson, this guy is different, because everybody tried to hire Orson at different times. Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, Daryl Zanuck. It's because he was quite famous in New York as a theater director. And he couldn't feel comfortable with any of these people. But this person who was a salesman and wanted to let him do whatever he wanted to do, and then he was going to sell it. And Hector MacArthur said, you can trust him, he doesn't interfere. So he signed with this guy for RKO, and he always said, and it's part of the exciting aspect of the work up to Citizen Kane, that this guy was very heroic. This guy was the unsung hero. Inside the studio, all the executives and all the money men said, no, over and over again. And Orson would go to him and they would talk. And George Schaefer had some good ideas about things, including the title. Citizen Kane is George Schaefer's title, finally, because they couldn't think of a title, and that was his title. So he had good ideas, but he also, throughout, backed Orson to the hilt, right up until the point at which Hearst and the Hearst chain went after Citizen Kane, and everybody in Hollywood, led by Louis B. Mayer, forced almost a boycott of the picture, and still Schaefer released it to small theaters throughout America and did the best he could. And he was undercut. Schaefer's strategy was that he was going to make money on Orson Welles in Europe, where people were sophisticated and where they would appreciate an artistic film. And he was brilliant at that, except World War II intervened as Orson was beginning to develop his first project, which was Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad story. And so their entire strategy went out the window of how to make money. Even so, George Schaefer, great hero, backed his casting when they cast people that aren't from Hollywood, backed the hiring of the Mercury Theater. So they're RKO, they have everybody under contract, but no, Orson wants his own people. Okay. Have his own composer, Bernard Herrmann. Okay. Have his own leading ladies nobody's ever heard of before. Okay. He only said yes. So it's not until later, when Orson's in Brazil and they're recutting Magnificent Ambersons behind his back, that finally the studio executives who hated George Schaefer all along for being an outsider and a non-creative person in their point of view, got him out. At which point Orson was out forever also. And they had been trying to get him from the beginning. But Schaefer's a great hero of the story in a very different kind of studio head. And strangely, not famous, and one of the heroes of Hollywood history, I think, George Schaefer. And we have him to thank for Citizen Kane, and if Orson was here, he would say yes, he was a hero. Back to him. He said yes.
Sí, perdón, ya se ha referido a Ciudadano Kane. ¿Tiene alguna relación con su niñez real? Esos planos con el trineo, creo que era un trineo, ¿verdad? En su época infantil con el nombre de Rosebud.
Well, I treat the sled and myth of Rosebud at some length in the book, and I revealed the true derivation of the name Rosebud. But Orson is in some ways, a perverse individual, and really the idea of the sled, he always said, was the co-writer Herman Mankiewicz's, and he also always said he didn't really like it. It was a kind of melodramatic device, and maybe he was just being grumpy about something that everybody loves, and that wasn't really his idea, which he always said that it wasn't. But the way the film is constructed and the way Rosebud is used in the film is Orson's idea, and I explain in the book, in various ways that Mankiewicz wanted to do it, but Orson said no. And that's kind of the idea of the book. So for me to summarize it is difficult, but throughout his childhood, he's running into the people that you later see as a composite of Charles Foster Kane. He's best the prototype for the Joseph Cotton character is Ashton Stevens, the leading dramatic columnist of the Chicago Hearst papers, who taught Hearst to play the banjo and was very good friends with Hearst and talked about Hearst all the time and corresponded with Orson all the time and took Orson to first nights of theater and symphony and museums. And then I went into his archives because this book was very much an archival book. And you see the letters between Ashton and his wife talking about going to see the Whistler's Mother exhibit at the museum in New York with Orson, and what they talked about and how they argued about the traditional romantics versus the new realists in American painting. So you see that character. You see in various ways Kane himself through the tycoons of Chicago, all of whom were involved in opera in sometimes quite messy ways, similar to the film, promoting their mistresses onto the stage with disastrous consequences. All of this, he's a first nighter at the opera. At his prep school, they went to every opera. Then, because they went to a good prep school, and because he knew everybody, afterwards they went backstage. And they sat there with Mary Garden, the great opera star of the time, and had a private meeting with her. And then their pictures would be on the front page of the Chicago paper with the visiting Shakespearean actors. So the opera aspect of the film, for example, is entirely Orson. So he gave up music himself. He was not. He liked to sing, and he somewhat badly, and he liked to perform and do anything. And he would play a banjo if you asked him to, But that's not what he did. But he loved classical music. He knew it. He knew opera like the back of his hand. He knew it backstage, front stage. He'd seen every performance. And if you read his memos to Bernard Herrmann about the kind of music that he wants, Bernard Herrmann's in New York because he doesn't work for RKO, and Orson's in Beverly Hills. They read like Hitchcock's memos to Herrmann for Vertigo or North by Northwest. Exactly this, and then I need exactly this, and something, quotation from that. You know what I mean. You can do it. And then, very, very specific, telling Herrmann, who he had a great relationship with, because he had worked with him on radio and they could speak in a kind of musical shorthand, telling him exactly the kind of opera pastiche he wanted. And that part of the film, as well as the tycoon who is William Randolph Hearst, who would come in and out of Chicago and who knew Welles's father, which I talk about in the book, who is William Randolph Hearst and is not William Randolph Hearst. That comes out of his boyhood. So you see all this taking shape as even before he gets to Hollywood in his story. And the newspaper background. He was steeped in the newspaper background. He would go to lunch with when he was a boy. When he was 12 years old, he'd go to the most exclusive clubs in Chicago for lunch with all the newspaper men and sit there and listen and argue with them. And they accepted him as one of them. They had known him since he was even younger. And so these aspects of it make the film, you know, I hesitate to say autobiographical because it's not autobiographical. And he would always say, but I'm not the poor boy who left his sled behind. I had wonderful parents who did not sell me to the bank. But there are many, many aspects of the story, from the rosebud, which everybody has a rosebud in their life in some way, to Kane, to the opera, to the newspaper, to the very specific characters and where they came from that are derived from his life story.
Hola, yo te quería preguntar qué opinión te merece a ti personalmente el montaje que hizo Jess Franco de la película, bueno, del rodaje que hizo aquí en España de Don Quijote, Orson Welles.
I'm not sure I know that because are you doing the Man of La Mancha? Yeah. Well, usually when I write a book, I have to comment on every film in the book. So I wrote a book about Hitchcock. I had to comment on 53 films that he directed and many, many more that he was involved in and all of his television shows. Because to leave one out would be to infuriate somebody somewhere. But this is a book in which I don't comment on a single film because the book ends before Citizen Kane. So I've heard many people talk about it. I've seen it. I don't like to have an opinion about it because I don't write about it. I didn't study it. I don't need to have an opinion about it. And I've been on a stage in America for the centenary of his birth, Orson Welles' birth, with the most prominent and important American Wellesians who devote their life to Welles and devote their life to minute scrutiny of everything he ever did. And I don't deserve to be on the stage with them. I shouldn't be there arguing about those kinds of things because I don't comment on them or discuss them in my book at all. And so I'm sorry I don't like to give an opinion about it.
Si se sirve a título informativo, yo te diría que a mí me parece lamentable.
Patrick, ¿qué opinas de la película de Tim Robbins que hizo sobre la juventud de Wells, que sale como personaje Wells en su carrera de teatro en Nueva York?
I'm not hearing you.
En España se llamaba Bajo el telón.
Yeah. By the way, I've heard that same opinion about the Man of La Mancha film, about the Don Quixote film, from the Orson Welles people in America. I like it, but it's terrible to Orson. I like it because I like its politics, it's very imaginative. Orson himself spent a lot of time at the end of his life trying to write and direct a version of Cradleworth Rock. And he worked out with Ring Lardner Jr. for a while, and then his version of the script exists. And he, like many of the other things he was doing towards the end of his life, it fell apart, it didn't happen. It was one of these things that broke his spirit. His script has been published. I draw on it quite a bit in the book because it's one of the examples of him working hard at creating a memoir or reminiscence of a certain period of time, and I compare it with what other people say about that experience. Tim Robbins' film is completely different. He comes along many years later, and he makes a very left-wing, almost Altman. I wrote a book about Robert Altman, Altman-esque film with many characters and a real tapestry of New York at the time. Not the kind of film that Orson was going to make. And Orson is depicted rather shabbily, I think. It's a bad part of the film, his portrait in the film. There's another film called, it's either Me and Orson or Orson and Me. It's by Richard Linklater, who did Boyhood. It's a fantastic film. Orson is exactly like that. It's very, without being realistic or factual or a documentary, it's a very credible portrait of what was going on when they were doing Mercury Theater production, and it takes place around some of the same period of time. So I like the Tim Robbins film, but not everybody does, and it's not for all tastes. And if you want to see, there are many depictions of Orson on film in different films and as a character, and they're interesting. I don't go into them, but I do touch on both the Tim Robbins film and this film, Orson and Me, or Me and Orson, with Claire Danes and Zac Efron.
Orson and Me.
Yeah, Orson and Me. And I think it's a Scottish actor who plays Orson. I don't know his name, I'm sorry to say. Yeah. It's a fantastic film, very wonderful, loving portrait of crazy, out of control, eccentric, brilliant Orson, who's at the center of basically a love story involving fictional characters.
Hi, Pat.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, as probably you're one of the people, as you've studied him for a long time, who most knows him, like even in a personal level, and even though you maybe never met him. But I was wondering, what is your personal anecdote? What is your personal moment you like most?
About him that I like most? Is that the last thing you said? Well, I don't know if I can answer that without giving it a lot of thought and calling you back in a day. But I would say the difference, one of the things very clear from my book, almost from the beginning, from the very beginning, and different than most other books, if not all other books, is that I like him. He's a great guy, fabulous guy. I was in his presence once at the American Film Institute Award. He came out all dressed in black, like a black Moby Dick or something, and heard him talk, and very impressive. But I like everything about him. He was a good guy. He was good to people. He tried to be good. He tried to do his best. His reputation has been hurt by people who come along afterwards and say, oh, he did nothing good after Citizen Kane, or he wasted his life, or he did crappy commercials on television. Some of that is true, but he didn't care. He wasn't doing what you program a person to do to become a successful celebrity with a pool and an agent and all these things that people in Hollywood were doing. He was doing something else, always, with his life. And it was something personal as well as professional, as well as artistic. And so a lot of people who have written books about him either treat him as a strange specimen, like in a zoo, or they don't like him. And they find him a failure in some ways. And my book is full of love and admiration for him in spite of whatever you think, because he had a great time. He did wonderful things. People would be, even people who he drove crazy, or went screaming out of the room after working with him for a while, did their best to work with him, did wonderful work with him, and he was not anybody's idea of somebody who does it the typical way. He was doing it his way, and I like that about him. So does that help a little bit? I like him a lot. I don't like everybody I write about, and sometimes it's a problem. You spend 4 years with somebody and researching them, and you find out they killed somebody or they did all these terrible things, and you have to, in various ways, think about these things. Fritz Lang did kill somebody in one way or another, and people are very bad to their children, and they're very bad to their wives and to women, and people do a lot of terrible things to screenwriters and so you have to think about these things a lot, and I don't always end up liking the people a lot or admiring them a lot. And it's refreshing, because I did not have this attitude going in. I didn't think about it deeply. What little I knew, I loved, about Orson Welles. But my hunch was that I would find out a lot of things that would really help form a portrait of him that was different. And that portrait I like and I admire without reservation. So when I say to you his career suffered because he spent 1 or 2 years writing newspaper columns and giving speeches instead of and working on crazy projects like Around the World in 80 Days for the stage, or practicing his magic tricks, you know. I don't say that pejoratively. I admire that. I say good for him. He wasn't doing, you know, the usual celebrity fame, big success thing. And what he was doing, and this is clear from his early life story and from the influence of his parents and all these district groups, district people that I have mentioned in passing, is that he was actually living a very, very personal life of self-expression. And I admire that. I like it.
Bueno, no sé si se me oye.
Yeah. Microphone? Sorry.
Sí, creo que estamos ante una persona bastante ecléctica. Y sin duda que viene de una familia, como vemos, muy influyente. Se podría considerar a Wells hoy en día un producto indie, o se ha ido, no sé si me explico muy bien, se entraría dentro de lo que es el cine, se ha dejado llevar o por su familia dentro de la cadena hollywoodiense, o si hoy pudiéramos considerarlo un cineasta independiente. Y otra segunda pregunta, yo he leído que Ciudadano Kane es la mejor película que se ha dirigido, cosa con la que yo no estoy en absoluto de acuerdo. Y después me parece una persona, yo como director no lo sé, pero un poco dictatorial, arrogante, con lo que no me encaja esa faceta izquierdista, esa faceta liberal, no me encaja nada en la persona de Orson Welles. Entonces, no sé, quizás sea una percepción bastante subjetiva. Yo la poca filmografía que he visto de él no me da esa sensación. He visto Ciudadano Kane bastantes veces y en ningún momento creo recordar se hace mención al hundimiento del Maine, lo que provocó la guerra de España con Cuba. Entonces yo no sé dónde radica esa faceta tan liberal que usted está dando de Wells. Es más, me parece que se ha aprovechado o se aprovechó en su momento de una proveniencia tanto política, familiar, circunstancial, para engancharse a la cadena hollywoodiense y no meterse en lo que es hoy el cine indie, por decirlo de alguna manera. No sé si me estoy explicando. En el cine independiente me parece muy dictatorial, una persona muy soberbia a la hora de dirigir tanto en guión como en producción, como en fotografía, demás facetas, muy influenciado por el expresionismo alemán. Y no sé, yo quizás sea una persona o un aficionado al cine muy crítico con este director, cuando creo que hay muchos directores que quizás hayan aportado muchísimo más y que él se haya aprovechado de todo ese contorno, o sea, de todo ese entorno para meterse en Hollywood. Hoy otro director no lo hubiera hecho, pienso yo. Se hubiera dedicado a lo que llamamos hoy en día el cine independiente. Pero él tenía medios económicos, tenía medios familiares, mucha influencia política y demás. Pero sí también, aparte de eso, si usted lo consideraría el mejor director y si consideraría que Ciudadano Kane es la mejor película de la historia del cine. ¿Y por qué?
Well, a lot to answer, a lot to think about in your question. Let me put it this way. I don't, when I write about somebody, call them the best or not the best, but other people have called him the best. At the end of my book, I look at the Sight and Sound poll in 2012 of 800 scholars, critics, etc., around the world, including myself. I voted. and note how many films he has on the list besides Citizen Kane, as well as Citizen Kane. And Citizen Kane was at the top of that list since, you know, something like 1962, and then for 40 years or 50 years until it was displaced by Vertigo, for reasons which I go into in my book. So I don't say it myself, but other people say it. But the thing about, the thing I react against, so I don't care when people like or dislike Citizen Kane, it doesn't matter to me one way or another. I like it. I think it's great, but I don't say that, you know, in order to provoke you or to say it in the book. But this thing about him being a dictator, I would respond to, because I've written about many, many directors of different types, and let's take the most liberal, independent type, Robert Altman, who people come and work with as a big family, and everybody contributes and improvises, and he's very warm and welcoming. He's great with actors. He's famous for being terrible to writers. And he gives the impression of not being a dictator, but all directors are in charge. So they're all, to some extent, you know, at points, have to say, I'm the boss and we're doing it my way. But if you look at the way Orson worked, it's the opposite of what you say. Particularly on Citizen Kane, but I know enough to say later on as well, that he gets some money, he wants to make a movie, he comes here, he looks around and he says, come here. Oh, do you do any acting? You look like, you know, and he draws very good things from people and gives them opportunities that they might not otherwise have. He works with Greg Toland as the cameraman on Citizen Kane. He puts his name on his card, his same screen card as himself. One of the, you know, myths of Citizen Kane is that, you know, who wrote Citizen Kane, him or Herman Mankiewicz? They share the credit. I go very, very carefully into that relationship, very, very carefully into the rapport inside the Mercury Theater, why things happen a certain way. I go very, very carefully into John Houseman, who is very responsible for this idea you may have in your head, and that other people have in their head about Orson, and who is the dissembler, is the kind word to put it. He tells a story, and I go back and I look at factually what he says and how it doesn't line up with actually what was happening. And he tells things to make himself look good. Orson's the opposite. He tells stories to make himself look bad quite often. So I'd say no, he's not particularly a dictator, and I would say he's very, very good collaborator with a lot of different kinds of people. In fact, one of his geniuses, if he's writing something, he wants to be alone, and he does good writing alone. But then when he is actually creating something, he needs company. He wants company. He's a social character. Hitchcock was the same way. It's no fun unless you have someone else there to both argue with and to create with, and he loves that part of it. And he was a great collaborator, and many, many people did their best. Writers, cameramen, musicians, actors, people who were just pulling curtains, you know, had the time of their life with him and did their best work. So whether or not Citizen Kane is a great film is completely subjective. But whether or not he was a dictator, I would say no, not at all. I mean, when he had to be. You know, there's a point when he and Herman Mankiewicz disagreed, and he said to Peter Bogdanovich, you know, I won the argument because I was the director. Who knows? Maybe he was right, but I won the argument because I was the director. Well, directors win arguments ultimately when they choose to. He could have said no to Rosebud. I mean, his agony was he said yes, and everybody liked it so much, and he didn't think about it. You know, he knew it wasn't his, and that bothered him. But no, he was a very, very collaborative person. He was the genius. He had the vision. He was the director. He was in charge ultimately. But he was a very, very good collaborator. And there was no independent cinema. There was no independent cinema. So was he a precursor of Altman? Yes. And later on, yes. Especially, you know, by the 60s and the 50s and the 70s, he's doing, you know, what Cassavetes and Altman and to some extent later even Woody Allen are doing, making films outside of Hollywood any way they want to, and audience be damned, money be damned, we're going to do it my way. And so he was a precursor of that, but there was no way to do it except to do it. And when you say he had money, no, I follow the money throughout the book. It's very, very funny. His parents had money. He had money in a trust fund. By the time he gets that money, it's like $2,000 for very interesting reasons. He never had money. His secret is he lived like a prince. He gave the impression of a prince. He was constantly working to make money. Get money, spend it. Get money, spend more. Get money, spend 3 times as much. Never had money. Never had money. Didn't start with money, didn't end with money. Didn't have money. Not real Hollywood money. Not real money. He didn't have money. So these are mistaken, I think, myths about him that I think maybe other books, earlier books, have promulgated. But I follow this idea of collaboration, how he works with people, and money very carefully in the book, year by year, really. You're the boss. But this lady wanted to ask a question, so maybe she gets the last question. Yeah? No?
Micrófono.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Espera un momentito.
Yeah.
Es que si no, no la oirá para la traducción.
Me parece que quizá el cuarto mandamiento, la película, podría ser un poco autobiográfica, sobre todo en la relación con su madre. Que prácticamente la madre muere por los celos del hijo y que quizás él pudo tener algo parecido. Y la ruina de la familia también.
Well, it's interesting about the mother, and it's interesting about the women in his life because the mother influences the women in his life. Remember, I'm telling a story. I'm telling a narrative. I'm telling a life story. I'm not analyzing. I'm not assessing everything as it occurs. I'm telling you in real time his life. However, I think his relationships with women are affected by his mother. There's a big question about his sexuality, how sexually active he was, the women that he was involved with. And so, for example, in my book, he's involved with very prominent women later on besides his first wife. And he's linked with them romantically in various ways. And I go into the archives, into their personal journals, into their bedside notes, and into chronology to see what actually happened between him and these famous women. There's a man named Michael Lindsay Hogg who directed pretty well known, he directed the Beatles film Let It Be, but also many BBC masterpiece films. And he wrote an entire book about how his mother, Geraldine Fitzgerald, and Orson Welles had a secret love affair, and he's the son. An entire book. A good book. Very convincing. Not true. Can't be true. I explain why in my book. Can't be true. It's impossible. So people want to believe myths about human beings who are important celebrities like Orson Welles. Sometimes he would say, later on, Henry Jaglom is arguing with him at lunch. There's a tape recorder under the table. Later, this is all published. And Henry Jaglom says, Michael Lindsay Hogg is going around telling everybody you're his father. And Orson says, well, he's a very nice guy. I like him a lot. And Henry Jaglom says, well, he says you slept with his mother. And no, you had a big love affair with his mother. Orson says, well, that's pretty unlikely since I never slept with her. But and then Henry Jaglom says, well, he's very adamant that you're his father. And Orson says, well, he's a great guy. I'd be proud to be his father, but I'm afraid that's not so. And you look at it. So he would tell people but they would want to believe the opposite. And on the last day of his life, he's on this talk show with his biographer, who is starting to tell about all of his love affairs to the talk show host and the audience, television audience who's being taped, and started talking about his love affair with the first Mrs. Charles Foster Kane, the actress Ruth Warwick, who plays Kane's first wife in the film. And Orson says, you know, it's not true, it's just a load of hooey, you know. And she said, oh, well, your chauffeur told me. And he said, oh, you're blaming it on a lot of dead people, you know, who just went around talking about gossip. He says, it's not true. And then he just kind of clams up and gets grumpy about it, you know, but he tries to tell people that these things aren't true about him. And so I go into his mother's death, her influence on his sexuality. There's always been rumors he was gay or bisexual. I go into this and try to explain what I think. And, you know, not everybody is easily categorized. And categorical terms are really, really offensive to people who shouldn't be categorized. So I think he's a difficult person to categorize in a lot of ways, because he's special, he's individual.
Bueno, con los individuos tenemos que dejarlo. Pues esperemos que el libro de Patrick sea traducido al castellano y podamos leerlo. Pues muchas gracias a todos y buenas noches. Arta de León, buenas tardes.
Gracias.